Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in India by Janardhan Ganeri and Peter Adamson, brought to you with the support of the King's College London Philosophy Department and the LMU in Munich, online at www.historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode will be an interview about epistemology in the Nyaya school of Indian philosophy with V.N. Jha and Ujjwala Jha, who are both former directors of the Center of Advanced Study in Sanskrit at the University of Pune, where Professor Ujjwala Jha is still professor of Sanskrit. Thank you very much for coming on, both of you.
Thank you so much.
I thought I'd start by just getting you to give our listeners a quick reminder about the Nyaya school, what the main characteristics of the school are, and who the main figures are, especially in the earlier period of Nyaya.
Yeah. I think what you need to understand is that Nyaya school is one of the 6 orthodox schools of Indian philosophy. The Sanskrit term for orthodox school is Astika, as against Nastika. The term for philosophy in Sanskrit is Darshana. You have to be a little careful in understanding Indian philosophy by focusing on the term Darshana. Darshana comes from the root drish, to see. It implies that we should visualize, we should see, we should discover, we should realize certain thing, the reality through philosophy. It is in this sense we have to understand the term Darshana. And Nyaya system is one of such systems of philosophy, and Gautama, the systematizer of the Nyaya philosophy, wrote Nyaya Sutra, and then we have a history of 1,000 years of dialogue through commentaries. So Nyaya Sutra, commented upon by Vatsyayana, which was commented upon by Uddyotakara, which was commented upon by Vachaspati Mishra, which was commented upon by Udayanacharya by 10th century AD. These commentaries are form of a dialogue, I have said, because there must be some reason to write a commentary again. In the exercise, there has been dialogue. So it's a deep kind of a dialogue, philosophical dialogue. So when Gautama puts some thesis, some theory, some point of view for consideration, it may not be acceptable to one and all. So questions were being raised, and in order to answer and to respond to those questions, commentaries used to be written. It is in this way we have a history, recorded history fortunately, of 1,000 years of intense philosophical dialogue. And in the course of time, what happened, they developed certain tools as well, because the idea was to communicate. One such tool was the epistemology. Another was logic. The other was a universal model of inquiry. So these are the things which happened all through these 1,000 years, and through that, a very deep epistemological results were at hand.
As we've been looking at Nyaya, we emphasized very much what you just mentioned, their contributions in epistemology and logic, but their seeking ultimate happiness fits into the project of the Vedic schools more generally. So we might think, for example, of Vedanta or of yoga. What is the relationship then between the Nyaya project of epistemology and logic and this search for ultimate happiness?
Right. Philosophizing should also have some purpose. It's not that philosophizing for philosophizing's sake. So Indian tradition of philosophy did not believe that philosophy should be simply a mental exercise. Thought was required to be put into practice, and that was the reason that philosophy has to address human purpose.
So is the idea then that I have beliefs about the right way to live, and then the thing that they're really interested in is whether that kind of belief counts as knowledge?
It is in this context you have to look into the first sutra of Gautama. He gives a kind of a roadmap of a man to arrive at the reality and identify who he is. And this has a context of the Vedic period, the earlier period, Upanishadic period particularly, where intensely this question is being asked, who I am. And that is why in the first sutra itself, Gautama puts this and says that by the true cognition of 16 entities that he has listed, pramana, prameya, I hope by now you are familiar with these terms. Pramana is the process of knowing. So how we acquire knowledge, process. And the system has accepted there are 4 processes of knowing. Prameya is that what we know, knowable. But one should be very careful. This prameya here, and the Vaishesikas also started to understand the entire universe through language. So when their prameya is the whole universe, and the term for universe the Vaishesikas introduced is padartha. That is the referent of language. So whatever language refers to is universe. And here, however, Gautama also uses the term padartha. He says, by knowledge of the 16 padarthas, one is going to acquire the ultimate goal of human life. But these padarthas are the entities which are required for engaging yourself in arguments in order to understand who you are. So if I am to discover myself, I will have to identify myself. And I am one entity in the whole universe. So me and non-me, myself and what I am not. Unless I know what I am not, how am I able to identify what I am? And therefore I must address my inquiry into the entire universe. And it is in this context he says that, well, this is why the Vaisheshikas are interested in knowing the whole universe. There also the term padartha has been used. So that padartha term is categorical. That addresses exactly the reference of the language, that is the whole universe is meant by padartha. Here, however, Gautama has chosen few padarthas, few entities which are helpful for him to identify the self as distinct from all that is not self. And to now link you this inquiry, and his answer is in the Sutra 112. Now 112 gives you the entire causal relationship. That why we are in a conditioned state. We human beings are conditioned state and therefore we are suffering. Now why? What is the meaning of conditioned state? Conditioned state precisely means that we have taken X to be Y. The reality is, if reality is X, we know it to be Y. So this is what he calls mithya jnana, a wrong conception, not knowing X as X, Y as Y, but we have taken to be true X as Y. And it is because of this mithya jnana, this misconception, the immediately what emerges in us is an attitude. That attitude prompts my behavior. My behavior then produces sometimes good result, sometimes bad result. But they go on accumulating in me. And ultimately, they become responsible for my coming again and again, going back. So the cycle of birth and rebirth is produced ultimately by mithya jnana. And if this is my state of conditioned state in which I am, and because of this I am suffering. If I have to go out of suffering, I should go out of, ultimately, permanently out of the cycle of birth and rebirth. And for that, since I have been able to diagnose the root cause of my suffering, which is namely the mithya jnana, now it can be cured, it can be removed only by yathartha jnana, tattva jnana. Tat is X. But so knowing X as X And it is that reason that if I have tattva jnana or the correct cognition or right knowledge, then my mithya jnana, my misconception will go out, and that will produce an attitude that will also be corrected. Then my behavior will be corrected, my actions will be corrected, and naturally that is not going to leave residue which will be responsible for bringing me to suffer in the cycle of birth and rebirth.
Okay, so that tells us what knowledge has to do with the wider aims of Nyaya, already in Gautama, as you've been saying. And I guess that's something that we associate with other schools, both Vedic and non. So, for example, the Buddhists also would say that knowledge is, in a way, the route to freedom from suffering. Let's now turn to your wife, Ujjwala Jha, who is going to tell us something about the other aspect of early Nyaya. And this is not so much epistemology, but logic. Now, obviously, if you're interested in knowledge, then you might be interested in things like truth conditions or arguments, and this is certainly something that we already see in Gautama. In early Nyaya, one of the developments that you get is a focus on the form of arguments, and they develop a theory of the syllogism, which may seem a little bit simplistic or ad hoc, but perhaps you can tell us about this theory and what there is to say in favor of it.
I think that one should not take the syllogism, which we find in the early Nyaya, as you said, as ad hoc. Because the Sutrakara has defined the syllogism. And there there are 5 members to this syllogism. These 5 members are very well defined by him and then explained by the Bhashyakara. Had it been ad hoc, it would have been abandoned afterwards, because if it had some purpose, a particular purpose to serve, and then when the purpose was over, this would have been abandoned. But as we find that the same 5-member syllogism is defended, is justified throughout the Nyaya tradition, and also up to the Nyaya Siddhanta Muktavali of Vishwanatha, you will find that he also is justifying and defending the 5-member syllogism. He belongs to the 17th century AD, and also Annam Bhatta in his Tarka Sangraha defends this 5-member syllogism. So Nyaya tradition is throughout justifying the 5-member syllogism, and Bhashyakara, even when he explained the 5 members, he took into account another view of another section of Naiyayikas who believed that 10 members would have been correct. So there could have been 10 members of the syllogism, and Vatsyayana has denied that possibility, and he says that only 5 members are there. So just to bring us to the stock example that the tradition gives of the syllogism, that is Parvataha Vanniman. So the mountain has fire, Dhumat, because it has smoke. Wherever there is smoke, so yatra yatra dhumaha, tatra tatra vannihi, yatha mahanasaha. This is the 3rd member. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire, just as in the kitchen. Then the 4th is tathacha ayam. The same is this mountain. That means the same smoke, which is invariably related with fire, is seen on this mountain. And tasmat tatha. Therefore, that is from the basis, from the dhuma, from the smoke, we conclude that this mountain must have fire. So this is the stock example that we find in the tradition, because dhuma and vanni, that is smoke and fire, they have this invariable relationship. So when one knows the invariable relationship between x and y, and when one sees x, then he invariably remembers y. This is the point, and this has been, justified and defended throughout the Nyaya tradition. Not that it was not at all objected to. We can find that Mimamsakas are always asking the question, why should you have 5 members of syllogism? 3 are enough, because they say that the 2 seem to be repeated. But this is not accepted by the Nyaya tradition. They have very much refuted the stand of Mimamsa. And we can find that even the Sutrakara, who defined the 5 members for the first time in the history of Nyaya, even he is aware of the element of repetition.
What exactly is the repetition? I mean, which two steps are repeated?
The first member is Parvataha Vanniman. So there is fire on the mountain. And the conclusion is, therefore there is fire on the mountain.
So it's like the first step is I say what I'm trying to prove, and the last step is I conclude from the syllogism that what I wanted to prove is true.
Exactly, it is like that. But those who want to say that this seems to be a repetition, I mean, they had some idea that this repetition, but this element of repetition is noted by the Sutrakara. So while defining the conclusion, for the conclusion we have a term Nigamana. For defining conclusion, the Sutrakara says that this is the Punarvachana. This is the restatement of the proposition. The first one is there is fire on the hill. It is called proposition, Pratidnya in Sanskrit. Then because there is smoke, this second step, Dhumat, this is known as Hetu in Sanskrit, which means probans in the, you can translate it into English as probans.
So the thing that proves something.
Yeah. So that is the basis of proving the object that you want to prove. Then the third one is you have to say that there is an invariable relationship between the two objects. That is the thing that you want to prove and the basis on which you want to prove it. So these two are then mentioned in the third step, which is known as example, and which is also a statement of invariable relationship. So both these are together. So wherever there is smoke, there is fire. This is the statement of invariable relationship. And as in the kitchen, this is the example of the same relationship.
So in other words, I've seen in my kitchen that whenever there's fire, there's smoke, or whenever there's smoke, there's fire. Yeah. So I can infer that that's generally true.
Yes, very much correct. But it is the other way around. It is wherever there is smoke, there is fire. Because the other way is not correct. Because there could be fire and there can be an absence of smoke. But the other way around is not correct. I mean, wherever there is smoke, there has to be fire. So this is, the smoke is the basis for inferring fire, and not fire is never the basis for inferring smoke.
Because I guess the idea would be if you lit a candle, you'd have fire but no smoke.
Yes, and there are so many traditional examples in the Nyaya tradition. They say that hot iron ball, it has fire, but it doesn't have smoke. So the area that is covered by fire is quite bigger than the area which is covered by smoke. And therefore there is terminology of pervader and pervaded. So what is pervaded can be the basis of inferring the pervader, but not the other way around.
How general is this idea of the syllogism supposed to be? Are they thinking that you can use this pattern of argument to basically prove any kind of questionable conclusion? So you can start with anything where you're trying to prove that it's true. You can use this 5-step syllogism and prove that thing.
Exactly this is the case. Because this is why it is there, because as Professor Jha mentioned, that the Nyaya is more or less trying to develop the methodology of dialectics. So in the dialectics, you will certainly require to prove your own point. And for that, you can use this method of inference. This is what we call Anumana Prayoga. So these 5 steps that we call Anumana Prayoga, the form of inference. So this is the form of inference which you can use. So we were talking about the 5 members, and the 4th one is, it is said to be confirmatory cognition. That the same type of smoke. So after you have the example, you remember the invariable relation, you confirm that the same type of smoke is there on the mountain. Same type of smoke we mean the smoke which is invariably with fire. And that is how it leads to the conclusion, the last step, that therefore there must be fire on this mountain. So this is how the conclusion comes. And
to add, it is necessary to have all the 5. Anything less than this is not going to complete the process. So all the 5 sentences should make one sentence, and that is called Mahavakya.
One thing that strikes me about this whole procedure is that, as you've just said, the situation that you're analyzing for this proof needs to be described linguistically. And yet one of the pramanas, the sources of knowledge that Nyaya recognize, is perception. And there's a debate within Nyaya and other schools about how those two things join together. So if I have a perception of, let's say, smoke, then it seems very important for the syllogism to go through that you've just described, that I actually understand that this thing I'm seeing is smoke, and I also understand that there's this invariable relationship between smoke and fire. What I'm wondering then is whether they want to say that that always comes for free with perception, so to speak. In other words, when I see something, it's not like I just see a black blur or something like that, but I'm already seeing it as smoke. Is that the idea? Or is the idea that perception gives me some kind of raw data that I then have to interpret using a concept like smoke?
No, I don't think that. I think you are taking me to another aspect. I should tell you that the Nyaya is utter realist, a system of utter realism. By this I mean that is real, which is knowable and nameable. And when I say it is knowable, there is a causal relationship between that which I know and the knowledge that emerges after that process of knowing. And a cause must precede the effect. And therefore, the world which I am going to know has to precede the knowledge of the world. And because of this, so this is a karana, and jnana is a karya. So a perception is a karya, is an effect. And perception of X, then X has to precede perception of X. And therefore it has to be independent of my mind. And therefore the entire world is independent of mind. And it is this reason, this is one aspect. Another aspect that there is a tradition of debate that the idealist held a position that reality cannot be captured through language. This started at the Upanishadic period itself, got concretized, formulated with the Buddhist logicians, and when it was taken for debate, Nyaya all along took the position that language also can refer to reality. And on these two issues, Udayanacharya of Mithila of 10th century wrote two texts. One is called Atma Tattva Viveka. This is to establish self. And the other one is Nyaya Kusumanjali, to establish God. So, be it a Paramanu, a subtle, which our eyes, normal gross eyes cannot perceive, or God, anything that exists is knowable and nameable. And it is by these two criteria alone, the reality claim is made by the Nyaya school.
So it's a very optimistic epistemology. And of course that means that they're under an obligation to respond to skeptical attack. And the skeptical attack duly comes, especially from the Buddhists. And there's a lot of things one could raise here, and we're going to get into Buddhist skepticism later on in the series. But I wanted to ask about one particular kind of skeptical attack, so you can tell us what the Nyaya school says in response to it. And this is basically a kind of regress argument. The idea being that whatever pramana, whatever source of knowledge I take, I have to somehow give a further reason for the reliability or accuracy of that pramana. For example, if I say, well, my perceptions count as knowledge, then I have to have some other reason other than perception which guarantees the accuracy or truth or reliability of perception. Well, that will be some other pramana maybe, but then I can just keep playing this game all day and there's a regress. So how do the Nyaya respond to this kind of demand for a regress of justification?
Actually, this attack or this accusation that pramana, that is the source of knowledge, if it is already known, then only it operates towards its object. This premise itself is faulty or defective, can I say, so that the accusation does not stand at all. Because Nyaya accepts that there are two types of sources of knowledge. A type of source of knowledge is known first and then it operates towards its object. But there is also another type of source of knowledge which, even not known, operates towards its object. So in Sanskrit we say Jnatam Sat Pramanam Bhavati. something is a source of knowledge when it is already known. It itself is known, and ajñātam sat pramanam bhavati. So something is a source of knowledge which is not itself known. If this is what you mean, then the very basic pramana they accept is pratyaksha pramana. That is the perceptual way of knowing things. So there the pramana is nothing but the sense organ. Pramana is the source of knowledge. What is the source of knowledge in perception? It is nothing but sense organ. And for perceptual cognition, one need not know his own sense organ. So eyes see color, or the knower sees through eyes a color of a thing, then he need not know eyes first. So that is not at all required. But there are the other means of knowing, namely anumana, upamana and shabda, which are accepted in the system of Nyaya. They are, as we discussed some time before, the process of anumana. There we saw that unless we know the invariable relationship between x and y, we are not in a position to infer y on the basis of x. So we saw that in the kitchen or in so many places we have seen that smoke and fire are together. So, but what is this? This is perception. So perception is the basis of all pramanas. So in other words, in the other cases, that is anumana, upamana and shabda, that is analogy and verbal cognition, in all these cases you must have some knowledge. That is knowledge of the source. It is very much required. So upamana, that is analogy, is also accepted to be an independent means of knowing. Analogy is nothing but resemblance, similarity. So unless you know the similarity between again x and y, you will not know one on the basis of the other. Similarly, in verbal cognition, unless you know the language, you are not in a position to understand what the speaker is saying. So for that also they say that pada padartha sambandha jnana, the relationship between the word and its meaning, must be known prior to the communication with the speaker and hearer. So whatever the language the speaker is using must be known by the hearer. This is the requirement for Shabda Pramana, that is for the verbal understanding. But one cannot accept the accusation, because for Pratyaksha Pramana, we do not need that the source of knowledge must be known prior to the operation.
That's really interesting. So in contemporary analytic epistemology, there's this distinction between externalist theories of justification and internalist theories of justification. And one way of putting the difference is that externalists don't think that the knower has to have access to the fact that what they believe is really knowledge. So they don't have to know that they know is enough for them to know. Whereas internalists think that you do have to know that you know in order to count as knowing. So to use this example of perception, an externalist would say, well, as long as your eyesight is working properly, and as long as the lighting conditions are good and so on, then perception is a means of knowledge. Can you be absolutely sure that your vision is working and so on? Maybe not, but it doesn't matter because it is working properly. Whereas an internalist would say, no, you actually have to somehow be sure. Like the objection, the regress objection says, you have to have some further way of being sure that your perception is working. So what's interesting about what you just said, I think, is that it sounds like they have an externalist theory of perception, but an internalist theory of other sources of knowledge. So for example, linguistic knowledge, you are able to know that your linguistic knowledge is accurate, even though they don't make that demand for perception. Is that right?
Yes, very correct.
One other thing I would like to ask before talking about the later development, historical development of Nyaya, is about its relationship to the other Vedic schools. It's famously associated with Vaisheshika, and you've already said something about that. But what about a school like the yoga tradition, which seems to be much more oriented towards practice and maybe a more kind of ethical or practical dimension of Indian philosophy? Is there any way to bring together yoga and these sometimes very technical issues in logic and epistemology that we associate with Nyaya?
Yoga also is a plan of a journey, inner journey I call it, from a conditioned state of man to deconditioned state of himself. Again, I recall Jayanta Bhatta, a Kashmiri logician, is a very fascinating man. He says that, well, up to this you can go with this thought. But unless thought is put into action, transformation is not going to be that easy. And therefore all the methods which were developed by yoga, by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra, need to be practiced by even Naiyayikas. Because ultimately it is a system for transformation. So external transformation will not going to help you. You have to transform inside. And this roadmap, which was prepared by Patanjali, should be made available to one and all systems, and the Naiyayikas have very happily accepted. It is in this way, particularly Nyaya is related to yoga philosophy.
I think that's really fascinating because it shows that in Indian philosophy, and I guess it's true of, for example, ancient Greek philosophy as well, you have in the same thinkers and certainly in the same traditions this kind of combination of highly technical philosophy and also a kind of ethical or shaping of the self tradition. And one question that arises, I think, here is how technical it actually gets, because we've been talking about, for example, the syllogism, but you gave sort of everyday example about smoke and fire. To what extent could we actually say that they develop something on the order of formal logic, the way that we sometimes see formal methods of logic being used in contemporary philosophy, sometimes brought into contact with epistemology? Is this something that we see in the development of Nyaya as well?
Maybe that you may not be able to say that the way formal logic is done in the contemporary philosophy, you may not find a similar type of formal logic in Nyaya. But Nyaya, through centuries, I mean, as we saw that from the very beginning, they have been talking about dialectics. And the dialectics was not getting successful because of some problems in the ordinary language. Because whenever we speak in ordinary language, there is a room for ambiguity. And that is how, I mean, whatever the Bhashyakara said was not properly understood by the Buddhist logicians. And they raised questions. Then further, those questions were answered by, suppose, Ujjwala. But then what Ujjwala had in mind was not again understood properly by the Buddhist logicians. And as it is mentioned that the dialogue of 1,000 years was on, and there is a record of this dialogue, we can go through the literature and we can understand that how one term is taken to mean something else by the other. And that is how actually the point of time came when they thought that the language of communication must be rectified, must be evolved in different way so that we can have some inambiguous or unambiguous or non-ambiguous communication. And that is how we find that after the time of Prashastapada belongs to 6th century AD. Prashastapada wrote a commentary on the Vaisheshika Sutras. So Vaisheshika Sutras are very old, maybe that same time with Nyaya Sutras, maybe somewhere 100 BC or something like that. But from that up to the Prashastapada Bhashya time, we do not have much literature in Vaisheshika. But the Prashastapada Bhashya mentions Ishvara. So Ishvara, which was accepted by Nyaya tradition, is now accepted by the Vaisheshikas. And so you can see that slowly the two have started merging into each other. And Udayanacharya, he wrote a commentary on the Prashastapada Bhashya. In his commentary, we find the traces of the evolution of new language. He wants that the same terminology should not be used so that the confusion arises. And that is how he started using some particular terminology to give the specific meaning, to give the precise meaning that if you want to say X, the hearer will understand only X and nothing else. That was the terminology he slowly started developing, and it was further developed by Gangesha Upadhyaya in the 13th century AD. And we go from Udayana to Gangesha through the contributions of Shashadhara. Shashadhara wrote one Nyaya Siddhanta Deepa, And one who knows, who studies Nyaya Darshana, he knows that Shashadhara was little compact, and Gangesha developed all his ideas to the fullest of extent. And that is how Gangesha's work, which is Tattva Chintamani, it belongs to 13th century AD, that became the magnum opus of Navya Nyaya. So there you find that the things are formalized in the sense all ambiguity has been tried to be removed. So to make the communication precise, this method was adopted by the Navya Nyaya language, and whatever emerged is now known as Navya Nyaya language. So that language is further, accepted by all the other schools of Indian philosophy. So after 13th century, whosoever is doing Vedanta, he will adopt Navya Nyaya language. Whosoever is doing other Mimamsa, he will adopt Navya Nyaya language. Whosoever is doing even grammar or even poetics, they will adopt Navya Nyaya language. They adopted Navya Nyaya language, and that is how they could succeed in their precise communications. Navya Nyaya means new Nyaya, new logic. So, but here you have to understand it as the proper name of the language. It is Navya Nyaya language.
Okay. So that takes us up to the 13th century or so. Can we say that Nyaya is a tradition that carried on through early modernity and even maybe down to the present day? Through the coming of Islam in India and so on? Is it, so to speak, a living tradition? We earlier we had the mention of the 5-step syllogism still being accepted in the 17th century, which is giving Aristotle a run for his money. Can we basically just say that Nyaya has always been there ever since its invention in Indian intellectual history?
I think so. I think Nyaya, you have to see up to 10th century, let us say one phase of development. And then whatever happens after 10th century is another phase. That is what is a new form of Nyaya, called Navya Nyaya. Mainly because by the time of Udayanacharya, as I told you, 10th century AD, he could have an overlook that why the same questions are emerging again and again. And then he identified that the problem lies in the medium of communication. And so language became very important for him. So as you have in the West a linguistic turn, which is very late phenomenon, after Chomsky. So we have in the Indian tradition at the 10th century, Udayanacharya coming and pointing out that language is that important, because otherwise how can we communicate? And unless we communicate, unless we understand each other, either we accept or reject. Because rejection and acceptance requires understanding. And that is obstructed by more natural language you are using for communication, perhaps. You are opening the gate for ambiguity. And therefore there is necessity to develop a new language of discourse. And that language slowly developed as Navya Nyaya language, new Nyaya language. And not only the Nyaya tradition or Vaisheshika tradition, by the time Vaisheshika Nyaya became one, because they all agreed with the metaphysics, same metaphysics, so there was no problem. Other systems, Mimamsa, Yoga, Sankhya, Dharma Shastra, Vedanta of 8 varieties of Vedanta, So all of them started philosophical discourse only through this medium of Navya Nyaya language. And to tell you the truth, that in each and every traditional Sanskrit education institution, even today, the debate takes place only in Navya Nyaya language. So whether he is a Vedantin or belonging to any other system of knowledge, the medium of discourse is Navya Nyaya language.
Okay, so we're not going to go quite that far in the coming episodes, but we are going to look at the tradition that's often paired with Nyaya, as we've been discussing, namely Vaisheshika. That will be the topic on the next few podcasts. But for now, I'd like to thank Professor Jha.
Thank you so much.
And Professor Jha.
Thank you very much.
who gave us our first opportunity ever to have a married couple interviewed on the podcast. So that was very exciting. And please join me and Janardhan as we start to look at Vaisheshika next time here on the history of philosophy in India.